audio to connect here, so we will get started in just a couple seconds, but I'm Vicki Markuson. I am the CEO of the La Crosse Area Chamber of Commerce, and a couple of housekeeping things. So there is, if you're on a desktop, there's a big chat bubble down the middle of your bar down at the bottom, and you can type any messages, questions that you would like there. We're a little bit smaller group, about 35 people, so we can even try unmuting if you want to do a live question. We're certainly open to that. Couple more people connecting in, so I'm going to stretch us. What I normally do, if you haven't been on one of these before, is I share my screen with some of the things that we are looking at. Obviously, the big news today is Senate. Was that just yesterday? Yes, that was just yesterday. Did pass the next version of the CARES Act. So I'm going to share my screen here and show you what we're looking at today. You should be seeing this U.S. Chamber top line summary of the new CARES Act funding. So essentially it is plugging more money into the payroll protection program. We know that those funds ran out last week, Thursday, I believe it was. Many have applied, not received funding, and we know some restaurants and retailers have been advised by their accountants to not apply for those until they have a date as to when they're going to open. And the thought process there is that the clock starts ticking as to when you need to restore your payroll by. And so if that clock starts ticking and come week 9 you haven't emerged and have your payroll where it needs to be, that loan does not become a grant, it stays a loan. And so that is a big component to the PPP. But I will tell you from what we're hearing from businesses, that is the #1 funding source that is coming through. I just heard yesterday of the first EIDL loan, the EIDL loan coming through. And as many of you know, that for some that first 10,000 is a grant. So many have applied for that, but very few have gotten paid. So going back to the new CARES Act funding, so there's PPP funding in there. There's also EIDL grants and EIDL loan funding in there. There's more coming to hospitals. So many of you heard that Gunderson's losing $1 million a day. And I also heard last month it was 18 million. This month they're on a projected $30 million deficit, and their check was 12 million. So there's a big hit being taken by our healthcare system. So there's 75 billion in there for healthcare providers, and then $25 billion for COVID-19 testing. So the big news yesterday was some metrics coming forward in terms of what's now called the Badger Bounce Back, which is when we'll start to turn the dial, seeing, okay, can we open up some businesses and see what happens with COVID testing? But the big known factor is there are some that aren't being tested just because I'm guessing they're not at the highest risk. And so once you introduce a lot more tests, you're obviously going to have more COVID positive cases. And so as we emerge and we open up some businesses, there may be some testing that becomes positive through no fault, if you will, of those businesses opening. And so this is really, as many of you know, this is a balancing act of making sure that those tests get out there so that we can have accurate COVID testing. So the other piece that we're looking at is the U.S. Chamber. So the Senate passed the CARES Act proposal. It now goes on to the House. They're expected to vote on this tomorrow. And so the U.S. Senate, what I will do here is I'm going to copy this and put it in the chat for everybody here. I'll do that. Here it is. It changes when I'm sharing my screen. Okay, after I stop sharing my screen, I'll come back and I'll put that link in there. But essentially they are asking everybody to sign this. Here's the content of the letter. And it basically is saying our businesses are struggling and we really need this funding is the best way to summarize that. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and Actually, I see the inspiration for this. Chip Schilling had shared some great economic information with me, and it really sparked saying, hey, why don't we get TJ Brooks, who is the chair of economics and the chair of finance at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, on here to talk about the economy. Obviously, another big headline yesterday was the oil prices. Obviously, it doesn't take much to see what's happening with the gasoline prices. But just record lows for oil prices, which creates another crisis, and our stocks are going into chaos. And so TJ can really help paint the economic picture of what's now, what's coming when we emerge, what does it look like? So with that, TJ, take it away.
Thanks. Thanks, Vicki. Let me share my screen here. Hopefully this works. All right. Hopefully you're all seeing the slides I have put together, and I'm happy to sort of share these. I'll send a PDF to Vicki afterwards. I'll roll through a few things quickly, but first, just know that I'm not a medical practitioner, not a virologist, nor an epidemiologist, but I am a doctor. That's just an old PhD joke. Anyhow, the things I want to talk about really quickly, and I'll try to keep this sort of relatively brief, but to paint a sort of picture of how I see the economics and what economists smarter than I am are talking about. Just first with a quick timeline, the policy responses we've had thus far and what we can expect going forward, and then what what opening up might look like from an economic perspective. So first, just the data we've all seen. The Financial Times has some really great graphics helping us understand this. The United States is now at over 800,000 cases. We have over 45,000 deaths. Just to remember, the first U.S. case, although it looks like it might have been a little bit earlier than this, is officially January 21st. That's been just 92 days. When we see a spread of disease like this, we don't usually count from the first case, but maybe start at a number like 10. That happened the 2nd of February. So it's been only 80 days since that. And in terms of the first death, that happened 2/29 in the United States. And the 10th death in the United States was just 50 days ago, and March 3rd. And we've been practicing social distancing for 36 days, and 45,000 people are dead. So you can imagine, you can start to sort of imagine what the consequences would have been like if we'd never practiced social distancing. The interesting thing to me is there's been an explosion in economic papers. There's lots of people, usually without kids, sitting at home with nothing to do. So they write economic papers very rapidly, and all of them are sort of coming to the same conclusion. Obviously, social distancing works. It's effective at reducing death and the number of cases. I put this together last night based upon the New York Times data, and you can see the hot spots. This is just the number of cases of COVID in different counties in the United States. This is looking at using that same sort of coding for the Midwest. You can see that Chicago is really the biggest area in the Midwest. Just be careful that I've changed the sort of coding, or actually my program sort of changed, because we obviously have many fewer cases here. This just shows you the difference within the region. Where you have Vernon County with none, and then you have Winona County sort of with, I believe they had 61 cases. So you get an idea. This is, I think, a video I wanted to show. This is the U.S. weekly initial jobless claims as a percentage of the labor force. Starting in the 60s, and you can see, those claims were recently sort of quite low after the Great Recession. And then I think you get this, dramatic sense. These are initial claims as high as, 4% of the total labor force in the United States. So, I hate that people keep using the word unprecedented. It is unprecedented. But what's really important to understand is this isn't a typical sort of recession. It's a man-made response to a pandemic. So that's going to give us lots of different things in terms of the traditional things we might do to try to get out of this or to help the economy are very, very different. But this really sort of gives you a sense for how rapid and how large that sort of initial jobless claims are. Looking at La Crosse County, here's the initial jobless claims. They don't have great long-term data on a per county basis, but they do have, and I'm sure the folks in Wisconsin have been really trying to put out good data, but they're probably swamped by unemployment claims, obviously. They do have the 2019 data you can see there. So typically La Crosse County is looking at, 50, 60. And then you see sort of what we've experienced. Our labor force is 66,000. So 2,000 is a large portion of that. If you look at sort of continued claims, we're at 8% or so at the moment, total claims as a percentage of our total labor force. And so you can see the predictions for the unemployment rate to spike. This is sort of the local pain. Excuse me. So let me talk about the impact, sort of the local, so the short run and the long run. So the short run impacts are the transitions from sort of one state to another, rapidly shifting location, anything about the type of demand. In the long run, we worry about sort of the falling income. They're sort of the more traditional problems with economic recessions, low demand, falling incomes and the like. But that short run transition was really painful. And, it's actually surprising to me. I hadn't realized quite how much the supply chain was specialized. So, I have friends who's, one of my colleagues' husband is a large animal vet and does dairy herds. And they're talking about, pouring milk out, and it's incongruent when you go to the grocery store and you see that there's not a lot of milk on the shelf. And it really is because these supply chains were highly specialized and not able to sort of easily cross over to get the milk that was being produced for commercial reasons like schools and restaurants, to get that into sort of the retail grocers. And so we've had that situation. And so, it depends on what market you are in. You could be selling all the milk you possibly can versus dumping the milk, which is, a real tragedy. The hope is that, firms can, as quickly as possible, recognize this as a longer term challenge and quickly move the supply. We're, probably drinking maybe not quite as much milk and cheese products. I think I read somewhere they're down about 10%, but they're not down by the 50%. So the supply has to move. The classic example, I shared this with my mom. I said, the people aren't going to the bathroom less, or excuse me, there was the shortage of toilet paper at the grocery store, and I said, this is ridiculous because people aren't going into the bathroom more. My mom said she was. But other than her, I don't think most people are, and yet somehow we have a shortage. Now, part of that was because people buying more than they needed, so you would expect this to sort of smooth out. But again, this is a place where the supply chain is very, very different. So the location with where we're going to the bathroom has dramatically changed. No one's going to the bathroom at work anymore. They're going at home. So we need twice as much paper at home and not at work. And if you think about it, you don't buy for your house that, the big roll of toilet paper you find at your workplace that is, effectively sandpaper, I guess. So that market, so that supply chain really has to move to the commercial market, and there's lots of challenges to doing that. And so this is where you see the for the short time period excess demand and then sort of excess supply that seems not to be matching. And I think it's a real sort of short-term challenge. Longer term, we usually figure these things out pretty quickly. This graph, I'm not 100% sure what to make of this. Vicki sent this to me, and it was interesting. They're trying to identify which areas of the country are most vulnerable to this, and from the employment perspective. So they're really looking at where the employment is, and then trying to identify in terms of which types of jobs they think can sort of continue on in this environment and which ones are likely to be lost. The moral of the story is, for this region, is we seem to be about the same as the U.S. economy on this sort of vulnerability index, which is interesting because, sort of, as we all know, we have a much higher proportion of employment in this area in manufacturing, for example, than the typical percentage you see for the U.S. economy. So given that this is our sort of estimate that we're about similar to the rest of the U.S. economy in terms of our vulnerability, economic vulnerability in terms of jobs. So what have our policy responses been so far? So monetary policy is, the Fed is often recently quoted as saying, Ben Bernanke said this actually, that the Great Depression, he said, that was our fault. That was the Fed's fault. The Fed sat by when they had the, sort of the collapse in investment and collapse in sort of consumption that happened. And the Fed watched banks fail, and it thought it was letting bad banks fail. And what was happening was the money supply was contracting and making it worse. They sat on their hands, and they caused what could have been just a recession to be a depression. The Great Recession rolls around, and the Fed has learned from its mistake and does lots of things. And that recession was only a recession and not a depression, in large part because of the response of the Fed. And I think they have remembered that. They've used all the tools that they have for this current situation as much as possible. And they've even invented some new ones and engage in some new activities. So the Fed obviously cut interest rates quickly. They not only cut interest rates, they've said they're going to keep interest rates low for a long time. That effectively helps to lower long-term interest rates. They've re-engaged in quantitative easing. They are continuing to sort of lend and acting as a backstop for several different securities markets. They've engaged in sort of what they call Main Street loans, effectively making loans, through banks to large businesses, and even trying to do some with smaller businesses as well. They're buying effectively assets on other people's books and providing them liquidity. They're doing a bunch of different things. I think the Fed is really doing everything it possibly can to keep the financial system as liquid as possible. And that means making loans and providing liquidity. And, pretty soon they'll be buying up all of the government debt they can get their hands on as the government issues debt to finance these programs. We know that in good times, this would be inflationary. And we think now it's the right thing to do. And we don't see signs of inflation or anything along those lines. So that's the Fed's response. Fiscal policy, you've seen it is unprecedented in its size, but that said, it is, again, unprecedented situation. People would like to see them doing more, and for some different groups. People see some groups getting money that they don't think they deserve. I think the challenging thing is to move this quickly is how you precisely target policy is a very, very difficult thing. So when I'm arguing with my brother about if a hedge fund got some money, I'm basically saying you wouldn't want to make the mistake of not giving someone money because you didn't want someone else to have the money. So you're better off flooding the zone and worrying about the people who shouldn't have gotten it after the fact. But having a well-targeted policy, we just don't have a system designed to develop a well-targeted policy quickly. That said, there's some policies that they've been proposing that would be poorly targeted, payroll tax cut being one of them. But you can see they've had the $8.3 billion for the preparedness, the first Family First Coronavirus Response Act, and the big one, the CARES Act. And as sort of Vicki just highlighted, there's additional money. I'm calling it 3B, which is really topping off the CARES Act and the PPP. There'll be a fourth round at some point. The states are going to come holding their hands out. As they engage in testing, tracing, they're going to have to hire lots and lots of people. They have lost probably a lot in terms of income tax revenue. And we don't want to have happen now what happened in the Great Recession, which is the federal government expanded fiscal policy, spent a lot of money, but sort of refused to give the states enough money to cover their debts. So the states contracted while the feds were expanding, and they really just sort of worked against each other. And this meant sort of fewer services provided locally and at the state level and other sorts of contraction. Of course, I'm self-interested. I want to see the universities continue to sort of operate. I would hate to see them lose a whole bunch of funding when, the only thing that's going to keep kids out of trouble these days is if they could take an online class. So we need to keep kids in school, right? That's just the college kids anyways. All right, so I'm going to skip the CARES Act. You've probably seen the breakdown, lots of different businesses. Some got carve-outs. The airline industry got some money and the like. They've been, sort of massively affected as well. In terms of what that payroll, the PPP plan looked like, we got a lot of money in this area relative to the eligible payroll versus some other places that saw less money as the percentage of eligible payroll. What I want to highlight here are estimates, though, of the state budget shortfalls. So we can see in the 2001 recession how much the state budget shortfalls were, and then in the Great Recession, what they were. And we're now looking at sort of seeing losses in next year far exceeding what we saw in the Great Recession. So I would guess and would hope that as the states start to band together and go to Congress, that they also see some funding as well. All right, so now about the, sort of moving towards the idea of opening up and what the economy looks like moving forward. Let me first just say that, Austin Goolsbee was Barack Obama's Council of Economic Advisors chair, and then he's been quoted as saying, the first rule of virus economics, which sounds a little bit like the first rule of Fight Club, is to not talk about it, but the first rule of virus economics is the best thing for the economy is anything that slows the spread of the virus. This is not just him, so the University of Chicago does a survey of top economists, some Nobel Prize winners, some Bates Medal winners, left, right, center, all over the political map. To the following three questions, they all strongly agreed. That is, a comprehensive policy response to the coronavirus will involve tolerating a large contraction of economic activity until the spread of the infection has dropped significantly. They think that abandoning severe lockdowns at a time when the likelihood of resurgent infection remains high will lead to greater economic damage than sustained lockdowns to eliminate the resurgent risk. This is really the important point, that social distancing and fighting the pandemic is an economic strategy. It's not one or the other. I think I didn't fully think about that at the beginning. I sort of thought, because the counterfactual in my mind too was like, we can just open up and people are going to go back to businesses like normal, and that's not the case. When you have a pandemic circulating, people pretty quickly figure that out. They talk to friends in New York. They talk to doctor friends that have seen this up close and personal, and they dramatically change their personal behavior, regardless of what sort of the government says that they should do. So anyhow, so that's what we want to think about. So here's his 3 sort of steps. So the first one is track down the disease. The second one is that you have to prevent forever damage from now problems. This is where we're the size of the now problems are really huge, and we're probably not preventing all the forever damage. And that's probably because, until we get a vaccine, which could be a bit, it's a lot, and Congress does not appear to have the stomach to do it all. And then after that, so as we sort of come back, then you can start with the stimulating consumption. He talks here about sort of stimulating via sales tax elimination, or like things to sort of encourage consumption. If you give people payroll tax cuts, if they're still nervous about going into the economy, they're not going to spend their money. So you have to have things that really directly encourage people to spend their money when it's safe. I'm going to skip these things, but I'll just show you this one quickly. This is using basically cell phone data to look at visits. And I just want to point out that the dramatic decline in visits in the different sectors, retail, information, healthcare, accommodations, and food, really started in Wisconsin, and it started before, even the bars closed. It started before the schools closed, before the safer at home orders. You can see that they really had a dramatic decline. I think if you sort of removed all those things tomorrow, you would not see a bounce back to previous levels. And so that should really be taken into account. This was a little graph going forward. I think we really face this, particularly here in La Crosse, when we have, I'd gone 11 days now without a case. People say things like, oh, it wasn't bad, we're overreacting, we should open up. The reality is that counterfactual, if we were completely open going forward, we would see. So this idea of opening up and returning to normal, the normal going forward is going to be one where we practice practice social distancing in everything that we do, practice safety, wear masks, wash our hands, don't go into sort of crowded places, and the like. Yeah, just to give you sort of a history lesson. So if you look at the number of deaths from the 1918 outbreak of the flu, you can see that the second wave was the most deadly. Even the third wave was more deadly than the first wave. And so that's something to sort of keep in mind. People will not engage in economic activity like they have in the past if they fear the spread of the virus coming up. And if they see a graph like this and they understand history, and we open up too quickly, as I think we are in some states, they're not going to get the economic activity they think they're going to get. So what does a return to normal look like? I think until you have a vaccine for this, or until 80% of the population is vaccinated, or you have treatments that dramatically reduce the extreme symptoms and the deaths that occur. If you have one of those two things, I mean, again, if you could guarantee people aren't going to die or aren't going to have permanent lung damage from this disease, they might just suffer for a couple of weeks, but we have good treatment. I think they're more willing to take that particular risk. But short of that, I think we're not going to. Otherwise, naturally achieving herd immunity. But what's important to realize that the epidemiologists really talk about the fact that we should just open up. We should just open up and let herd immunity take over. There's an overshoot that happens. Like once the cat's out of the bag, and the virus spreads rapidly, we end up having more people infected than we would need to achieve herd immunity, because it's just spreading so rapidly. So even achieving herd immunity should not occur without social distancing in place and slowly over time. And then the fourth one, which is the one we're going to all try, is massive increases in testing, tracing, immunity identification, and quarantining. And that requires everybody to follow what they should be. you've all probably seen something like this. We're nowhere near having the ability to sort of open up in terms of having the metrics. We haven't achieved any of them. We have some signs of progress. I do know we're ramping up testing in the state, but until you get sort of rapid, high quality, accurate testing, I know some of the testing has false negative rates that are probably too high to be useful. All right, that was lightning talk, but I'm happy to answer sort of questions about the material I presented.
Any questions out there? You can either do it through the chat or you can unmute. And while you process all of that amazing information. So one of the things, TJ, that I want to ask you about is, so this is as you said, it's a man-made response to a pandemic. This is also going to be a man-made return to economics, right? So like normal, if this were a light switch and everything turned on, the natural economy would play in, right? And things would start rolling around and change. So what does it look like and I know you don't probably know what this looks like, but you've probably read something. So having certain sectors emerge that doesn't take into account what's happening globally, like this is just a complicated mess, right? Because the global markets and the supply chains are disrupted. And so what does it look like? Even businesses that get approval may not get what the supplies they need. What does that look like?
So I think what needs to happen is that, so the part of the problem is I get why it happens. So this idea of an essential business. Frankly, as an economist, I think all businesses are essential, but I realize sort of the need to try to paint those lines. It's easy to communicate. It's easy to sort of close down. It's easy on that level. We need to move to more of a safer practices model, right? Where all of the economic activity is engaged in safer practices. Meatpacking plants, they need to figure out how to run meatpacking plants where people aren't standing on top of each other. And that's the only way that's going to come back, is when they can figure out how to reorganize the way they do business. So how I see this happening going forward is that the supply chain quickly figures out how they can do their business, or businesses, as many of them as possible, in as safe a way as possible, and they move to that model as quick as possible. And then we will see a return to business. Maybe it won't be as rapid. Maybe it won't be the economic growth won't be as fast, and production won't be as fast, but it would still be occurring, and be occurring through sort of all channels. There are, again, some things which we are going to have to think about, like that just can't happen because they can't be practiced safely. But otherwise, I think that it's less about sort of particular industries in terms of the long run, but more in terms of like who can practice the safest, the quickest, and those other industries that can't should be working to get there as quickly as possible.
So Chip Schilling asked, any idea or guidance on how long the recovery will take, where the economy, employment, et cetera, will get back to pre-COVID-19 levels?
Oh yeah, so in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we wiped out 22 million jobs, which took us 10 years to sort of accumulate. I think what we hoped early on was that we would have these sort of stay in place orders, and the government would back up people's pay. And so we would basically become France for the month of August. We would pay everybody to take a vacation, and everybody would still have their jobs. And then the vacation would sort of end at 4 weeks, and we would go back to work. And if that could have happened, it would look just like vacation does in one of those countries. It's just a small blip that happens seasonally. The longer this goes on, I really think the answer is when you have a vaccine. So it's the time to get the vaccine, I think, is what sort of matters. And the longer this goes on, the more permanent the scarring is, and the more challenges that we're going to have. But I think, we've already into it far enough that I think even the recovery, we wouldn't be recovered in 2 months, even after just a month. We are looking at sort of a longer recovery. And that's just the nature of sort of recessions and that in general. Sort of, I think people will use this as an opportunity to reorganize. Some businesses will be lost forever, and it'll take time for someone to start a new restaurant or whatever that business might be. So it will take a while.
The question I have is, so other areas of the country have seen different demographics impacted than we have. There tends to be more racial demographics. Here, a lot of the people that lost their jobs tend to be the hourly workers, right? So how does that particularly impact our economy and our ability to bounce back?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, so you know, in my situation, I'm still I have a full-time job. My wife has a full-time job. We now have a third full-time job that we split between each other. The daycare workers, our university is still paying the daycare workers for the time being, and we are not having to pay for those services. So we're effectively, you know, taking on that work ourselves, and that's the case with some. Some of those things are being done by other people, and some of those things aren't being done at all. But it is sort of, you know, those types of jobs have not been able to transition very well. So it has created, you know, a class of people that are that don't have anything to do, and a class of people that are working 10 times as hard as they were before. And so I don't, you know, I don't know that I see any particular solution or have any great insights of what that impact is for the economy, because those hourly employees can really be in all different sectors of the economy, and they can be having an impact on absolutely all of the different industries.
So question from Sam, is a small market like La Crosse more or less susceptible to these kind of macro trends, and why?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think, I mean, I think in this particular case, we're going to face some of the same things. Where we might benefit is that because we have a low exposure now, risk is a little bit less here. Like, I might do things here in town that might be that I would probably maybe not do if I were in New York City, right? So, you know, that in that sense, in terms of the virus sense, we're a little bit different. But in terms of sort of reaction to the rest of that's going on, I mean, you know, we're still involved in the global supply chain here. You know, we depend upon all those things. This is a shock that is transmitting itself through the entire economy, and really is, you know, again, we're in more manufacturing. We have more manufacturing employment here. And I think that vulnerability index was trying to get to this particular question that you're asking, Sam. And they didn't have a lot of details. They were willing to sell the data, but they didn't have a lot of details in terms of how they came up with it.
I think one of the factors, TJ, that you and I emailed back and forth about was the tourism industry. So it's that hospitality, if you will. We obviously, that is a big draw. What are we, ninth, I think, in the state of Wisconsin? And so those are the businesses that are shuttered right now. It's the restaurants, the retails, right. Anything fun to do, anything to attracts tourists and people from outside are obviously the ones that are going to expose us more. Is if we open up, we had this, not you and I, but others have had this conversation of the last thing we want to do is to become open, and then we're attracting people from Minneapolis because we're the only thing open, right? We're the bright spot in the state for fun things that are open, and that's going to create a whole other complexity. But going back to the vulnerability graph, I believe that was one of its contributing factors, was to say of who's shuttered, who has the highest composition of these type of jobs, and that's why we ended up being high, well, being average, if you will. We have the manufacturing offsetting that, but that might be a contributing factor. Okay, sorry. Question from Mike Jankowski. Do you see that the stimulus packages will prevent entrepreneurs from bankruptcy? And when their income goes away, how will they replace that? Yeah,
I mean, I think, no, I mean, I think that the business failures are obviously going to go, you know, to ahistorical levels, for sure. I do think that there's some, depending upon what, you know, what they were doing, that will be able to weather this particular storm. The great thing about entrepreneurs are they always figured out sort of ways to do things new, different, and better. So that would be helpful. But some of them are probably stuck in industries, you know, like tourism or like other areas that are just that can't practice in a socially distanced, safe way, and are probably going to be gone forever. Or, I mean, there's a possibility that, you know, there's things that need to be done. My brother's in this situation, and you know, I'm encouraging him to find something to do for the short while. It's not to sort of give up long term, but what he was sort of pursuing, opening a tasting room microbrewery, is not something that's going to pay dividends in the near future. And the degree to which he can financially afford to sort of set that aside and do something else is for the time being is something she should do. And that's again, I think, will be true for a bunch of people. The degree to which they can literally shutter and the burn rate of shuttering is low enough that they can sustain it for a long enough period of time, they will be able to open back up. But for some places, the burn rate in terms of the cost of their building or cost of maintaining some of their other fixed costs is too high, and will have to sort of close. And I mean, it's horrible. I mean, there's so many horrible things about this, and that's just one of the many.
I was frantically digging for my notes from earlier today and I can't find them, but I was on a call with a gentleman, one of the guys from Shark Tank, I think his name, Mike Kane. I don't watch the show, but anyway, he was talking about entrepreneurs. So
Yeah.
fundamentally, entrepreneurs identify an unmet need out there and they form a new business model. And that's what has disrupted industry after industry after industry. And then to TJ's point, the entrepreneurs that may not have already emerged may be better positioned, unfortunately, than those that have. And those vulnerable companies are in those first 5 years. Those are the ones that, if they don't have an innovative way to emerge, are going to be struggling. The biggest piece, Mike, that I hear, and I'm sure we have some of them on the call, is it's those individuals whose businesses require contact, right? How do you teach dance without being in a room with a bunch of people? And so those are the ones that are particularly struggling because they haven't found a way to sell their product another way. And a lot of companies, just to stay active, have been doing a lot for free. And so that is logical from a marketing perspective. And the last comment that was shared was, if you have something to sell, this is the time to market it. And if you don't have something to sell, that's when you logically, from a marketing perspective, don't. But the question becomes, so you have, right now, TJ, there's an interesting thing happening with unemployment. So I know of businesses saying, I want to bring people back, and unemployment is paying so well, I can't get people back off of unemployment because it's $600 a week on top of what they would be earning. Even the $600, I think, is $15 an hour, and trying to get people back into some of these hourly positions is going to be challenging. So my question for you is, we also have some federal funding that's artificially supplementing, right? So is there a logical way that you have seen to start to ramp that down so that we can get people back into jobs?
Yeah, I think, there are a few economists, tend to be more conservative, that sort of argue that was a potential incentive incompatibility with unemployment insurance and would like to have seen something different. Again, we were forced to sort of, I think, use the mechanisms already in place. In other countries, they could have just paid people their lost income, as opposed to sort of adding sort of this extra income and then throttle that down. I think once it's time and safe for people to start going back to work, I think the government will have to sort of reduce the generosity of those benefits as needed. It's a tough thing though. Like you don't want people to be forced into going back to an unsafe job because they're not getting enough benefits. That's half the reason we did what we did, was to keep them at home and keep them safe and keep them from spreading the virus, just because they had sort of the economic need. So it is a balance and difficult. I do have a feeling that I have a hard time believing, with 22 million people unemployed, that firms that really want to hire somebody at some point won't be able to find people to hire to work.
Any other questions out there? Nobody. Quiet group. I can look at mine.
Hey, Vicki, this is Jim Germain.
Yeah, go, Jim. Yeah, great. Yeah. Good to see you. Or not see you, hear you.
Yeah, you can hear me. Sorry, my laptop's turned down. So, but earlier today during lunch, I was listening to a WGN program that had completely opposite views with regard to the economy and the market, and probably makes for pretty good radio, but kind of left me wondering, which way do we think this will go? And I was wondering if maybe we have an opinion on it. Basically, the philosophy that one provided was that the impact of the overall downturn in the economy will probably not be felt until later this year, fourth quarter, and may even extend into 2021. as we start to see businesses being shuttered and, individuals not being able to, make their financial commitments. So he was kind of the opinion that we're going to have like a double dip where, we went down to 18,000 on the Dow. We climbed back up to around 23, and then it'll probably drop down to around 15,000 and stay there for a while.
Mhm.
On the flip side, a little bit more encouraging view, the other economist was talking about kind of this pent-up demand through large institutional investors that need to be at certain position levels with regard to the Dow, and they're going to be on a heavy buying spree, and that actually will drive things up. And he was predicting that a year from now we'll be at 33,000. I guess I'm wondering if your guest has an opinion on either of those, because obviously they're totally different.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think, well, first of all, I'm not a financial economist. My HSA was cashed out for me in February, and so I've been in cash since the beginning of February, before this started, and I did not get in because I think that the market is being overly optimistic. I'm going to point out that the stock market is not the economy, although those two things should trend together eventually. They do diverge for periods of time. So I think I agree with the first statement that in terms of the economic recovery, it's going to be long and there's a potential for sort of double dip. We're into that point of time when it's pretty clear that there isn't enough sort of stimulus to go around in terms of replacing people's incomes. And so those income losses will result in consumption losses, which will be felt as a recession, and it'll take some time for that demand to return. Plus, as I highlighted, opening up is not really going to be fully open. And so that lost demand and consumption is going to be what we would call recessionary. In terms of sort of what this means for the stock market if businesses get going, the stock market should ultimately care about sort of earnings for these firms. And if people aren't buying their stuff, they should really care about that. While it might be true that people are saving money and they're trying to sort of get back into the market instead of being in cash, it doesn't make sense to be paying more for stocks than their sort of earnings dictate. So in the long term, those two things should be the same. That doesn't mean that there might not be some areas of the stock market that experience a boom as cash comes off the sidelines into the stock market.
Very good. Thank you.
Another question from Chip. Any thoughts on what the new normal will look like when COVID-19 passes regarding permanent changes to the way we live, do business, or work, interact with each other?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chip. I've been thinking a lot about that. To me, this is, every recession, the Great Depression, for example, if you knew a grandparent or a great-grandparent that experienced the Great Depression in an old enough age for it to really imprint, you heard stories about them having cash in coffee cans or under mattresses and those types of behaviors that they just couldn't get rid of for the rest of their lives. They never wasted any food. They never, all the different behaviors that were sort of permanently imprinted on them. I feel like each recession has something like that. I do wonder what this one brings. I mean, I'm probably getting in the habit of washing my hands more than I ever have. And that probably will stick, and that probably will be, good for me. I did see there's some epidemiologists talked about the fact that our hygiene as a society had been going down over the years. So this might be an actual boost to our hygiene. So those are some things like that. In terms of other sorts of work things, I mean, I think what we're finding is that so lots of businesses for a long time, their employees had wanted to sort of work remotely. And they said, no, you can't. And then the government came and said, you have to close down. You can't work at work. And then suddenly the firms are like, oh, you can work remotely. Like our university is a good example. We argued for years and years about which employees could work remotely and which couldn't. And suddenly we're all working remotely and we're surviving. Now, I think what we'll do is figure out what things we can do remotely and what we can't do, what we're better at, what we're not as good at. And so some of those types of things. I mean, behaviors, we've had Skype for a long time. I Skype my parents every day. I wasn't Skyping them every day before. Maybe I called them on the phone. And so you just, I think as you get into some of these behaviors, you make sort of changes, and some of them will stick and some maybe won't. I hope I do not have to be a preschool and kindergarten teacher for much longer. That's one habit I'm looking to break, I hope. As much as I love spending time with my kids, I'm not very good at it. To be in the teacher part, that is. Anyhow, so I think there are lots of things. I don't know all of them, but I'm sure, Chip, you have things in mind too.
The piece that I've started to see, I think I've seen 2 just this week, webinars on the changing layout for offices. So we over time have moved to open and collaborative, and now we all get to come back and physically distance in that environment if offices have switched to that. And so there's probably going to be a little bit of reversal around that. And so I've not attended one of those webinars yet, but I have seen those. So people are starting to think about, this is not going to be business as usual. This is going to become a trend. And I've said this from the get-go, even with our team, of this is not probably the last virus that comes our way. And obviously the flu's always around there, right? So, so we're preparing for a new normal, as cliche as that is. Any other questions out there? Okay, well, thank you, TJ. This was
thanks for having me.
very enlightening, and we're going to ask you in another month when we know more, and you'll have a whole new presentation for us, right? So
I'll say the opposite of what I said.
right,
that was. Yeah.
right. All right, thank you all. Be well, and we hope to see you at another chamber chat soon. Take care.
Thanks.